Former student Jerry Cooper told NPR that even a lot of orphans who simply had no place to go were sent to Mariana. He says overall, the inmates at Dozier weren't bad kids. Sure, they might have needed help in some respect, but this wasn't the place to find it. From the very beginning, the facility was subject to scrutiny. As early as 1901, there were reports of children being chained to walls, and a 1903 investigation stumbled upon the chilling discovery that the school was allegedly using leg irons on the students. Still, despite 6 total investigations being conducted during the school's first 13 active years, little was done to intervene or improve the basic quality of life for the boys, and this was only the start. A school cemetery called Boot Hill was designated on the north side of campus, an unusual addition for a youth facility in most cases. But the Dozier School soon witnessed a disproportionate number of deaths, with a 1914 dormitory fire wiping out 6 students and 2 staff members. Soon after, the flu epidemic of 1918 was reported to have tragically killed 11 boys. And despite periodic investigations in the century that followed, the Dozier School was allowed to continue operating with little interference, so it wouldn't be until 2012 when researchers from the University of South Florida, who had been authorized by the state to conduct a forensic anthropology analysis of the school grounds, would uncover sickening evidence that shocked and disturbed the entire country. 55 burials were found on Dozier School property, and a record of 98 deaths were found in historical documents. And then in 2019, workers surveying the grounds with a ground-penetrating radar in preparations to clean up the area of any pollution located something far more gruesome, what appeared to be a possible additional 27 graves.
So this school was literally killing boys. They were killing boys, abusing them, and killing them. This was a prison for boys. Did you know about the Dozier School? I didn't. Lived here for well over 35 years. And I had no idea about the Dozier School. A lot of people question, what is the Dozier School? Well, Dozier School, or the Dozier School for Boys, was a reform school up in the Panhandle of Florida that was known for correcting boys and young men so that they would become more productive members of society. But from looking at the history, it did anything but that. So we're going to be getting into that. And one of the things I want to talk about is an article that recently came out that shows that there was a link between a lot of men who are on death row and the Dozier School. Let's get into this right now, because there's a lot of people this is when we talk about this is the school to prison pipeline on steroids. So we're going to be getting into this here. So this is an article at the Tampa Bay Times. This came out just a few days ago. It says dozens of teens from abusive Florida reform schools landed on death row. It says Michael Bell, set to be executed Tuesday, which is today, is among at least 34 boys from the Dozier School later sentenced to death. Did abuse make them more violent? And this is the part where a lot of times people do not, they think that, oh, well, we just got to focus on punishment and not true, actual restorative justice. And I want this to be a lesson to all of us, that true restorative justice turns people into better people. It doesn't make them worse, which makes you think about our prison system, right? The recidivism rates, as well as how prisoners behave once they're there. Let's get into this. All right. All right. So let's get into his here. This is a statue from there. It says 8 years before a jury sentenced him to death for 2 murders, and he confessed to 3 more. Michael Bell spent a time at a Florida reform school so violent that the state later apologized for the abuse and paid millions to the victims. By the way, just to let you guys know, reparations had to be paid to the victims of this school. $20 million. $20 million was paid in reparations to the victims of the Dozier school. That's how bad this was. I want people to know the magnitude of how horrible this school was. And it was a state-funded institution and ran. Says the now 54-year-old Bell, who was scheduled to be executed on Tuesday, spent 4 chaotic months at the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys in Marianna during 1986 and 87 when he was 15. Not that long ago. I was alive. Says guards forced him to fight much larger boys at least 6 times, taking cash bets from the Dozier employees on whether he would win. When they threw him face down on a cot in a squat building, everyone called the White House and told him to grasp the handrail while beating him with a leather strap until he bled. They shackled his arms and legs and left him in that position for hours. Bell was among at least 34 boys who stayed at the Dozier school and another 16 sent to Okeechobee, a separate boys' school with a troubled history, who ended up on Florida's death row, according to a review by the Marshall Project. At least 19 others, and possibly many more, went to prison for murder, but were not sentenced to death. 25 of them were killed when they were 15, 16, 17, or 18, soon after departing the reform schools. Combined, the men who attended Dozier and Okeechobee have killed at least 144 people. It says most people who are tormented in childhood do not become murderers, and it can be difficult to know why someone commits violence, experts say. Some boys who went to Dozier likely would have committed murders regardless of the trauma they suffered at the reform school. But research shows that childhood and adolescent abuse does affect brain development and can make people more violent. Bell and other men sent to Dozier around the same time described the Marshall Project to a culture of fear, a foreboding that escalated at night when older boys stole in through the windows and beat up or sexually abused younger ones. And so I want people to realize the state literally allowed this to happen. And people will go, oh my God, I cannot believe that the state would allow this to happen. Really? Really? I got 2 words for you: chattel slavery. You don't think that the state wouldn't allow things like this? You have to realize you literally live in a country where they focus more on carceral punishment than they do on restorative justice. Hell, restorative justice isn't even part of our Constitution. And one of the reasons why this is so bad is because, number one, it was affecting working class and poor boys. And secondly, would this have gotten as much attention if it were all white boys? But no, if I'm sorry, if they were all black boys, it wouldn't have gotten as much attention. But a lot of white young men, a lot of white boys were also abused in this school too. And so it was really across the board. If you were working class and you were deemed a little bit too troubled, you were a little bit too difficult, you were sent to the Dozier school. And we get into a video that talks about that. Let's continue on. Did you guys know about this? Some of you probably did. Dr. Woods is a neuropsychiatry specialist from California who offered expert testimony in a 2010 case of another death row inmate sent to Dozier as a child. Woods said the institution literally beat the humanity out of some boys, whittling away their value for human life. Dozier helped make these boys killers. As Bell was convicted for the 1993 shooting deaths of 2 people in Jacksonville parking lot. He sat in a Duval County courtroom, some 24 family and friends behind him in the gallery. His lawyers fought for his life. Governor Ron DeSantis had just signed his death warrant. Witnesses testified about whether the original detective and the prosecutor in his case had coerced him into testifying against Bell at his 1995 trial. The judge would later rule they had not. And his 73-year-old aunt, Paula Goins, who worked 35 years in a federal court and arrived in a wheelchair, brought up Dozier in her testimony, saying, "I know Michael has never been the same since that Dozier school." She said that boy came back home damaged. So it gives the science about it because it talks about how, the human brain isn't truly fully developed until the age of about 24, 25, which means that the prefrontal cortex, which is responsible for judgment, impulse control, and other things that are very important for us to be able to regulate as adults, are not fully developed. So when it's in that development stage, when it gets damaged, well, then you wind up with adults that have very little impulse control, very little self-control. They can become very violent very quickly. And so this is what happens. And now I want to ask you this. What do you think happened to a lot of our parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, and so on and so forth, especially those of us who are Black American down the line, who we had to endure things like chattel slavery? Think about the mental trauma, the emotional trauma that we've had to endure as a people where this happened. Think about, let's just go across the board to all races, right, within this country. How many of you have been raised in a household where you guys were spanked because your father did it to your grandfather did it to your father, and your great-grandfather did it to your grandfather? And it wasn't just a SWAT. No. You know what I mean? See what I mean? And so it passes down this carousel punishment that ultimately is saying, well, we got to correct you in this way by force, even if it hurts you mentally. And what did our ancestors do? They did the same things, but they did it so that if they did it, it wouldn't be as harsh as when the white slaveholders did it. So then we can keep ourselves in line so that we won't get damaged even more by the slaveholders. Let's continue just a little bit more. It says neuroscientists have found that an abused child's brain will not mature as easily. The brain matter covering its connections is damaged with cuts, similar to how a worn wire may fray and split. As a result, the brains of abused children are more prone to arousal and less able to regulate impulsive behavior or control angry outbursts. So that's basically part of the science. It says it was during this sensitive time of adolescence that Bell first experienced the harrowing world of Dozier. When Bell's appeals lawyers, assistant federal public defenders Greg Brown and Teenie Martin, examined his case in recent years, they began to wonder about the school's impact on their client. They also soon noticed that a number of death sentence men mentioned in the state-run school in their appeals. Attorneys in death penalty cases often raise the issue of past trauma as a mitigating factor for juries to consider when deciding punishment. Yet, no lawyer had previously brought up the sexual assault and beatings that Bell witnessed during the stay at Dozier. Brown and Martin said Bell never had a psychological examination. The more they researched, the more they learned that he was someone whose brain likely had been scarred by violence, first in his childhood home, in the streets in North Jacksonville, and later at Dozier. A violent environment, they learn, can damage the brain and make teenagers engage in risky behavior. So we got to realize that the systemic abuse starts early. And then we're sitting here wondering to ourselves, oh man, why is crime going up so much? Well, here you go. Because then it becomes a cycle of abuse. Because guess what happens when these young men become fathers? What happens to their kids? What happens to their little brains when they also suffer some of the abuse that their fathers have had done to them? So then it's a cycle and it continues on. And then as it continues on, and guess what? Then you have people who are more prone to having less impulse control, more prone to angry outbursts, less clear judgment. So then what happens? Well, crime happens. Crimes against people happen. And then guess what? It gives the state what? An excuse to do what? It gives them more of an excuse to come down on us as citizens. Because the state knew this was happening and looked the other way. But are we also continuing this within our own households? That's another question. Are we making it so our children are more susceptible to become victims of the state, whether either through methods like this or a little bit later in life when they're young adults, and then next thing you know, the state gets them in that way as well? And I'm not going to be able to read this whole article, but I want to stop here. It says, if you have grown up in an environment where you are being cruelly treated and beaten, you are emotionally and physically in constant danger, your brain is going to read and perceive danger in everyone. That was from clinical psychologist Marlene Israelian, who has a practice in Atlanta. It says you perceive a threat even in the abuse. You perceive a threat even in the absence of a threat because it's the adaptive thing to do in order for you to survive. So that's what happens. So I'm going to put the article inside the chat for everybody so you guys can read that entire article. But we're going to get even deeper in this. because I want you guys to see how deep the rot goes. So we're going to get into this. Let me see here. Yeah. So we're going to get into this this video here. This video says these boys went through hell, the Dozier School of Horrors. So we're going to start right here.
1. New Year's Day of 1900 rang in the grand opening of the Florida State Reform School, which would later go through a few name changes before ultimately settling with its trademark Dozier title, in honor of a superintendent. But who exactly was in charge of this place? Originally conceived in 1897 under a legislative act, the school was first overseen by 5 specially appointed commissioners chosen by the governor. The stated purpose was reportedly to provide a place where young offenders against the laws of our state might be separated from older, more vicious associates. Well, if the goal was to keep vulnerable kids away from dangerous adults, you'll soon see that this was a failure of epic proportions. For a considerable time, the school was the largest juvenile reform institution in the United States. A sprawling open campus that encompassed 1,400 acres, the premises felt separated from the rest of society, its own little world, often the only world its students really got to see.
Okay, when we first got there, we were taken up to the Florida School for Boys by a deputy sheriff from Bradenton, Florida. We got there early in the morning before the administration office had opened to check us in, and the place was absolutely beautiful. We thought that it was going to be a wonderful place to be at.
One of the saddest things about this situation is that it seems like so many boys with nowhere else to turn may have really thought this place would offer some semblance of a home, or at the very least hoped it would give them some help. And you know, reform is a pretty broad term, and so I found myself wondering, what did these boys do to get sent here in the first place? Well, it turns out the criteria was pretty wide-ranging, as in you could get sent to the school for theft and murder, or you could get shipped off merely for what they call incorrigibility, which seems to mean just being generally disobedient.
So it sounds kind of like the way they treated Black people during Jim Crow. Where it's really for just seemingly innocuous reasons, or it's just, what is incorrigibility? I looked up the definition. It basically means the ability of, you're not able to be corrected, right? And so the question is like, in our mind, we think of a well-behaved child as a child that does whatever we say, that says yes, and is dutiful and quiet and doesn't challenge. But that's also how you get sheep as adults who follow whatever the powers that be say, or because of peer pressure, they'll get themselves into trouble and do whatever their peers say because they don't challenge. And here's the thing. A lot of parents back then, it was basically just do what I say, do what I say, and don't question it. And so with that being said, you could be sent to Dozier School for being a child that questioned, simple things that your parents asked of you. And instead of the parents actually being responsible and going, okay, so this is why I'm asking you to do what I do, what I need you to do. They just go, no, just do what I say. And there is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You also got to remember something. I want you guys to remember something. A lot of those slaveholders were fathers and mothers. You don't think that some of the ways they treated my ancestors were some of the ways that they may have treated a little bit their children a little bit? maybe they treated the children better, but children were also seen as lesser than, and they were to be seen and not heard back then. So it goes to show that they're not necessarily as they're also not necessarily as seen as free to be able to say or do what they want either. In some ways. I mean, it depends, between, from family to family, but largely, especially in the South, it's, children need to be seen and not heard, even in white households. So you can get sent to reform school pretty easily for even questioning. Let's continue.
Get caught playing hooky, smoking a cigarette, or running away from home, and you had a pretty good chance of being admitted to the institution. This was along the lines of what Charlie experienced.
We were sent there for being incorrigible. We skipped school and smoked cigarettes. Came from a very poor family. Mother and dad had divorced, and we kind of had to raise ourselves at early ages.
Former student Jerry Cooper told NPR that even a lot of orphans who simply had no place to go were sent to Mariana. He says overall, the inmates at Dozier weren't bad kids. Sure, they might have needed help in some respect, but this wasn't the place to find it. From the very beginning, the facility was subject to scrutiny. As early as 1901, there were reports of children being chained to walls, and a 1903 investigation stumbled upon the chilling discovery that the school was allegedly using leg irons on the students. Still, despite 6 total investigations being conducted during the school's first 13 active years, little was done to intervene or improve the basic quality of life for the boys, and this was only the start. A school cemetery called Boot Hill was designated on the north side of campus, an unusual addition for a youth facility in most cases. But the Dozier School soon witnessed a disproportionate number of deaths, with a 1914 dormitory fire wiping out 6 students and 2 staff members. Soon after, the flu epidemic of 1918 was reported to have tragically killed 11 boys. And despite periodic investigations in the century that followed, the Dozier School was allowed to continue operating with little interference, so it wouldn't be until 2012 when researchers from the University of South Florida, who had been authorized by the state to conduct a forensic anthropology analysis of the school grounds, would uncover sickening evidence that shocked and disturbed the entire country. 55 burials were found on Dozier School property, and a record of 98 deaths were found in historical documents. And then in 2019, workers surveying the grounds with a ground-penetrating radar in preparations to clean up the area of any pollution located something far more gruesome, what appeared to be a possible additional 27 graves.
So this school was literally killing boys. They were killing boys, abusing them, and killing them. This was a prison for boys. And the question remains, why did this school exist? Why was this allowed to continue? How many young men, how many boys grew up in our state and now are emotionally damaged? And because of their emotional damage that they've endured in places like Dozier School, they're around us in the general population and they have to not only deal with the trauma that they've endured, but when it comes to maybe their outburst of anger or their impulsivity or things like that. We have to be on the receiving end of it. And there was no true healing for them. Last month was Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. Yes, it was Pride Month as well, which I also celebrated. But it was also Men's Mental Health Awareness Month. And that means that there is no regard for the mental health of men and boys when it comes to this state and institutional levels. Because if a boy is incorrigible, what outlets does he have? You heard what the gentleman just said. Parents were divorced. They pretty much had to raise themselves. They were poor. This is a white man. So you can imagine what black people were going through too. And that's the problem, is that when it comes to mental health, when it comes to our development, when you're working or poor class, they do not give a damn about us. And that's what's sad. And then they expect us to follow in the straight line for the sake of being good little workers for the corporations. And if we fall either to the left or to the right, as far as, not politically, but, by the wayside, then there you go. Got a Florida State Troopers. You got the Orange County, you got the county sheriffs. You got the city police. They're there to pick us up, take us to jail, process us, and if they can convict us, then they throw us into prison. And then we become slaves for the state. That's the sad part. There's a lot more. Let's continue on.
And while authorities certainly weren't prepared for this jarring outcome, it would be a lie to say that it came as a complete shock to them. That's because the Dozier school was actually shut down in June of 2011, closely following an alleged failed annual evaluation in 2009. From what I was able to gather, a large number of complaints alleging mistreatment by the guards to the inmates was in part to blame for the school's poor performance. Apparently, a 2010 report even found that some boys claimed to be subject to sexual misconduct by the staff. With all these alarming discoveries, it isn't hard to see why the state soon pulled the plug. Although interestingly, budgetary limitations was the main reason ultimately cited for the closure. Either way, after 111 years of suspicious activity, officials finally put an end to the institution. But how in the world did all these young boys die? Well, as former students have begun raising their voices and sharing horror stories of their time at the school, the real crimes which are alleged to have taken place at the infamous Dozier School are coming to light, and they are far more extreme and disturbing than anyone could have ever imagined. To put it plainly, the Dozier School is now accused of carrying out a long-standing tradition of alleged abuse, beatings, torture, and even murder. But before we get into the ongoing investigation, it is important to know the questionable history of the institution and all the red flags that should have led to its demise long ago. The early years of Dozier were fishy enough as is, with so many supposedly accidental or disease-driven deaths being largely brushed off by the public. But the school's reputation would take another serious hit in 1968, when after visiting the premises, Florida Governor Claude Kirk lamented that somebody should have blown the whistle a long time ago. He documented holes in the leaking ceilings and broken walls, bucket toilets, and no heat in the winter, ultimately declaring it a training ground for a life of crime, and quipping that if anyone found out their own kids were being kept in such circumstances, they'd be up there with rifles. Overall, it seems that living conditions were horrible and the campus was seriously overcrowded. The school underwent several staff and management shifts, but still, things didn't get any better.
So, back in 1968, they said, this is horrible. And yet the state allowed it to continue. You guys wonder why we talk about we need to end the system? This is exactly why. This system does us no good. It is no good to us at all that this system is, the way it is. And they go over the gory details of what has happened at this school. And I want to go over also the racial aspect of this too. And so I'm going to put the link to this video because this video is lengthy, but you guys will be interested in watching the full thing. But they go over, firsthand testimony as to what is happening in this school. I want to get into what they call the White House Boys, which basically the White House was a building at the Dozier school, which a lot of torture and beatings have happened. And so let's get into this. Now we're going to get into the racial aspect as well.
The boys were forced to work without pay. This included harvesting crops, manufacturing bricks, and other dangerous jobs for children. When he was 11, Richard Huntley cut sugarcane at Dozier.
In doing so, I accidentally struck my right foot, and severed the top of my toe. The state of Florida held us like slaves. I went to a field, I worked every day, and I never got paid for it. But I see my country talking to other countries about making their children work for nothing. Nothing.
And this is also the economic aspect of this issue. The economic aspect of this issue means that there were companies that were utilizing the slave labor of boys that were not in prison. They weren't in jail. They were at a reform school. And they literally had to work for free for the state. And that's what a lot of them were doing. So now we're getting into the economic aspect of this. Why was this institution allowed to continue? Here you go. It was slavery. And they were being beat by their overseers, the guards. They were being abused by their overseers, the guards. This is supposedly a reform school. There was no reform going on there. By no means, no reform at all. And this was a state-ran school. State-ran. Florida. Let's continue.
This happened on American soil, people. This happened in Florida.
This is a story about children who went into state custody, died, and were never given back. Their families weren't given an answer. Their remains weren't given back. And that's, why this is so important.
For years, there were the rumors. Kids disappeared in the night. Families informed that their child passed away without explanation. Even less communication. And few bodies ever returned home. At the edge of the campus is an area called Boot Hill. White and black boys were buried there. No markers were placed until the 80s. For decades, it was unclear how many boys died at Dozier, until the survivors and families of the dead began speaking up. In 2009, the then still active Youth Correctional Institution on the former Dozier campus failed a state inspection. Investigative reporting from the St. Petersburg Times also shared the stories of survivors and families of those who died at Dozier. Those factors prompted investigations from the state and federal government, which confirmed the historic and recent allegations of abuse and violence at Dozier. That was just the start of the process to fully uncover the horrors of the reform school. In 2000,
And I know it's gruesome, but they were just showing the splattered blood on the walls from boys in the past being beat to death. That is this system. That's how horrific it is. And so when people talk about, well, why is crime so high? Or why are people so unregulated and emotionally stunted? Well, look at what the state's doing. Look at what they're allowing. And so I want people to know that it's crimes that are being done to us and around us that we may not even know about. The Dozier School opened in 1901 and it existed for over 110 years before it was closed down. This was so bad that literally Ron DeSantis he actually approved of reparations. Let's go here. So it says DeSantis signs bill that provides $20 million in compensation to Dozier School for boys victims. So let's get into this. The bill signing was done privately in Tallahassee on Friday. So this happened last year. Last year. That's how late this is. Says Governor Ron DeSantis has approved a measure that will finally provide reparations for hundreds of men who, as children, were beaten and sexually assaulted for decades while in the custody of the state. The law, HB 21, signed by the governor on Friday morning, will divide $20 million in compensation between those who attended the Arthur G. Dozier School for Boys in Northern Florida between 1940 and 1975, as well as their Okeechobee School, another state-based institution known for its abusive nature. So you notice they only did it between 1940 and 1975. They're not doing it for boys who were there between 1901 and 1939. What about those boys? Now, a huge chunk of them are probably dead. But what about what they've suffered? And how is that carried on by their families? You know what I mean? And also, what about the Dozier School boys who were there in the 80s, in the 90s, in the early 2000s? What about them? Says, according to Bill analysis, there were reports of children being chained to walls and irons, brutal whippings, and peonage at Dozier as early as 1901. In the first 13 years of operation, 6 state-led investigations took place. After former Dozier students began to publish accounts of their abuse, the complaints gained traction. Ultimately, the then Governor Charlie Crist in 2008 directed the Florida Department of Law Enforcement to investigate the Dozier school and the deaths alleged there. Meanwhile, the school was closed following investigations in 2011, and lawmakers gave a formal apology to survivors in 2017. So they were children. Says that through the application process, the law says that only those who are confined to the Dozier School for Boys or the Okeechobee School between 1940 and 1975 are eligible. Personal representatives or estates of those attended the school but have died may not file an application for or receive compensation. That's according to the law. Applications will be accepted until December 31st of this year, which means that it ended in 2024. Although it has been frequently mentioned, there are approximately 400 living survivors of two institutions who are eligible to be compensated. Other survivors, 80-year-old Tampa resident Gene Luker, told the Florida Phoenix after the measure passed in the Florida Senate in March that he believes that far fewer than that are still alive. So even any compensation for what has happened, I don't think they went far enough. That's not far enough. It didn't cover the boys that have been affected after 1975. What if you were there in 1976? What if you were there in 1986? What if you were there in 1996 and you were abused? And by the way, if you went to the Dozier School at 14 or 15 in 1996, guess what? You're the age as one of my brothers. It's not that long ago. I was in middle school in 96. Hell, I could have been put into the Dozier School. This is why the system needs to change. Because the state will even allow things like this, which means the state has to change. We need a new state, not reform, revolution. I wonder how many of you guys knew about this. If you guys didn't, now you know. Thank you so very much for watching my channel, and I deeply appreciate it from the top and bottom of my heart. If you wish to support the channel further, so I can keep bringing you content that is educational and informative, you can become a patron on patreon.com/Jaybefaunt. You can find that link in the pinned comment or in the description below. No matter what you give, you'll be supporting independent media and education that helps make the world better. Thank you so much, and you can watch more of my content here. Mwah. Forehead kisses, and have a beautiful day.